Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Stiglitz and Miss Malin Ripa are now coming up to the stage. Please greet them with a big round of applause.
Thank you very much. Sorry for that slight delay. So I'm delighted to welcome Malin Ripa, Vice President for the Volvo Group for Social Corporate Responsibility, Joseph E. Stiglitz, we're told, who needs really no introduction, obviously from Columbia University, recipient of the Nobel Prize, somebody who's been really an advocate for much of what we've been discussing here, but most importantly, and perhaps least known, the recipient of an honorary degree from Madagascar University. He was just telling me, possibly the only recipient in this room of an honorary degree from Madagascar. Let me start with you, Professor Stiglitz. We've been talking about well-being, really in sort of society at large, partly from a statistical point of view, a measurement point of view, partly from a state, a government point of view. How do companies fit into this discussion? Can you provide a framework for us?
Yeah, there are actually several ways. I mean, first, we have to remember that people spend about more than a third of their waking life inside the company. So the quality of life inside the company really is an important part of the quality of life in general, part of their well-being. So the way one structures the employment relationship, the working conditions, are really important for individuals' well-being. And if you talk to people, when things don't go well at work, they don't go well in general. So I think that's the first, really important. And that includes, I think, democracy in the workplace, the role of unions, a whole gamut of issues. The second is companies produce the goods that we consume. And if, like Volkswagen, they're contributing to pollution and cheating, obviously that's a very negative effect on our environment. If they produce foods that lead to childhood diabetes, that creates a whole other set of problems with well-being. So in a way, the material conditions under which we live are very strongly set by the business community. And then the third is the relationship between the corporate sector and what I would call the public sector. And here there are two aspects of it. One is, I keep saying, the first important element of corporate responsibility is paying your taxes. Mm-hmm. If we don't have tax revenue, we can't provide for public goods. And a lot of corporations spend a lot of their energy avoiding taxes. Apple is really the star, but in demonstrating how you can use the same ingenuity that produces good products to avoid paying taxes. But there are a whole other set of relationships between the business community and the public sphere, whether our oil companies campaign against regulations that are necessary to attain the Paris goals, good environment, makes a big difference. They have a lot of influence. So that's what I would say the third sphere in which they affect our well-being.
Okay, well that's a very sort of interesting perspective. Malin, let me take you up on kind of those almost in turn. I mean, you can talk about your own company, you can talk about Sweden, or you can talk about your observations more broadly about the rest of the corporate sector. I mean, first of all, this notion of how companies treat their own employees. Sorry. How do you see that, and how is that progressing? I mean, on the one hand, there may be there's more time off for when people have babies. There may be shareholder schemes where people benefit from the profits of the company. On the other, we're told people are working a little harder and harder. There's more casualization of labor. How do you see this from your perspective?
Yes, thank you. I would like to say that I think the issue of well-being is something that is very much connected to productivity, and that employees enjoy their time in the company and stay. So working on well-being is very much a critical business issue for us, because we want the best employees. Just talking about my sector representing the commercial vehicle industry, we are now facing the largest transformation since the trucks were invented. We don't really know how the future of transporting goods and people will look like. And of course, we need the best employees to actually address this challenge. So working on well-being is, of course, a huge thing for us, but it's also a competitive advantage. 2 weeks back, I visited my colleagues in India, for example, and talking to my colleagues in India, asking, why do you choose to work for the Volvo Group, which is like an international company based in Sweden? And they say, because it's the culture and how you treat the employees. So I think that doing this in the right way, that's really an advantage for the companies.
Okay.
But how do you explain, I understand Volvo is a good Swedish company, but I come from America where we have a lot of companies that are not doing that, and retail, where they have split schedules, work on call, 0 hours. They obviously aren't agreeing with you that creating a happy labor force that is with well-being is profitable. Why do you think it's profitable and they're taking just the opposite view? They're trying to make their workers miserable.
Yeah, I think it's the way I can't really speak for those companies, but in general, I think maybe you look upon your employees as production resources instead of human beings. And I think that's the big difference. And I think in Sweden and other companies, we have, so to say, moved beyond working with people management and health and safety and work with work-life balance. And of course, this is also an issue, because now we have the millennials coming in, and we have to understand what is work-life balance, because it doesn't really mean that you only show up at work when you have time for it, which actually could be the case. But I think that if you really want to keep, of course it depends on what kind of job to be done, but if you work in a production like in Volvo and you have a rather tight schedule, you have to adjust the schedule to ensure that your people show up and they are healthy, because otherwise you disturb for others as well. And they have a quite high skills level, so we can't easily replace them. But of course, in Sweden and other countries, and also being in a circular business like ours, we have to deal with the flexibility. I think that is the main issue for us, not partly half time and so on. It's more to navigate within the business cycles.
So Malin, I mean, on the spectrum, I think no one would doubt that Volvo and the Swedish corporate culture is probably, much on the better end of the spectrum than someone working in a kind of windowless warehouse packing stuff, in the middle of the US. But, and here's the but, there are tensions, aren't there? I mean, if you are a company, and just whatever the model of your company, you answer ultimately, I'm putting it to you, to your shareholders.
Yes.
So if you tell your shareholders, you know what, we're going to halve our labor force's working hours because we really want them to see more of their children, or we're going to double their wages because we really want them to be happier, your shareholders might object to this if it's going to hit their profitability. So there is a tension there.
Of course, that's what business is about, finding a business case for certain issues. And of course, we can't really just raise the salaries or lower the the working hours, because we are also in a competitive industry with competitors all over the world. So, of course, we have to. But I would also like to talk about the Swedish model that we have, where you have the unions representing the employees, which I think is quite a strong foundation of the Swedish society. So we have the collective bargaining agreements where we set all the frames for how to all the conditions that actually applies to the company and our employees. And you have this kind of negotiation between the company and the unions. But we also have the dialogues where our management on a regular basis meet with the unions to explain about the business situation and so on. So I think this kind of tight dialogue together with the agreement is actually, then we gain an understanding of the different circumstances.
So Professor Stiglitz, what she's describing in a sense is a kind of a more of a stakeholder form of capitalism that you see in continental Europe, perhaps in Scandinavia, Japan to some extent, but really quite different from the Anglo-Saxon model where the shareholder has become more and more sort of king. How do you see these two views of capitalism, these two flavors of capitalism?
Yeah, so first let me say, the idea that by maximizing shareholder value, you would maximize societal welfare is a notion that was propagated by Milton Friedman with no basis in economic theory. That it was, I did work 40 years ago showing that in the context of economies in which there are imperfect risk markets, imperfect capital markets, and so forth, shareholder value maximization does not maximize societal value. And Sweden is a representative of that they actually do look at things beyond that. Now, the second point, which is sort of illustrates a dimension of this, is the short run versus the long run. A lot in the American model, it's the short run value maximization.
We're talking about quarter to quarter.
Quarter to quarter. And obviously, you can't make long-term investments in people or in capital, in research and technology on a quarter by quarter view. So actually, that kind of short-run shareholder value maximization is not long-term productive for society. I mean, it really is counterproductive. Now, I actually am supportive of what you might call the stakeholder capitalism model. You have to get a balance in trying to represent and try to get a better understanding of how it's not only the workers and the shareholders, it's the customers, it's the communities in which the company operates. If a factory shuts down, it has very big effects. Right. And markets are imperfect. You can't buy insurance against those effects. No. You can't protect yourself. And so society is better off overall if when you make those decisions, you're aware of the cost that you're imposing on these various segments. Right. So to me, that's a very fundamental. Now, the two issues that then come up, how can we make capitalism work better, companies work better? There's one idea that one of my colleagues at Columbia has been pushing, Patrick Bolton, which is loyalty shares, where those who keep on their shares longer have more votes. So you get the company to reflect the long-term owners, not the guys who just bought it to make a quick killing. So I think that's one, and a couple countries have actually embedded this. But a question I was going to ask Malin was the following: how do we make more companies or more countries like Volvo and like Sweden, and less like Walmart and the United States?
Thank you. Wow, it's a big question coming from a Nobel laureate. I'm really honored to answer this one. But I think that, I think first of all, we need some kind of a normative to discuss about the responsibility of a company. Because I think all companies, we want to be relevant. And if we are not relevant, that will hurt our license to operate. And today, a big extent of the value of a company is immaterial assets. So we have to protect those. And I would like to propose that companies should work on 3 different levels with their engagement for the society, but also internally. And I think in the bottom, we have like the license to operate. That is when you assess the ethical issues that a company has to address, like human rights, corruption, environmental degradation, and so on, and employ that throughout the value chain by putting requirements on suppliers, but also understanding how do I affect my own operations and the communities where we work, but also how do we do business? Who do we sell to? How do we mitigate or use our leverage actually to use the products should be used in the best way? So that's like the first level, and this is something that every company has to have in place, because that's the fundamental. And as we have heard, we have a lot of norms that is actually applicable for a global company as well as the SMEs. It's the United Nations Global Compact 10 principles, it's the Universal Declarations of Human Rights, and so on. But then you have the next level, and that is about the role in society, because I think most corporations understand that if we are going to be successful on a market, the market has to be healthy as well. Otherwise, there is no business for us. A healthy market means healthy business. And I think still companies aren't really mature enough to take this kind of discussions. How do we engage in reducing corruption, or how do we try to be a part in increasing the respect for human rights? Because the simple equation is really that if there is a too unstable market, that means a lot of risks, and that means no direct investments from the companies. And I think we have to have more of a dialogue around these issues, because it's not so widely discussed yet. And the last part is really about differentiating in and addressing these issues into the core business of companies. And that means that if I only sell diesel engines, my products or customer offer will not be relevant in the hopefully sustainable society going forward. So I think that companies, we have to work on all these 3 issues.
Right. No, that's very, sorry. I was saying, I was nodding my head, basically.
So I think that is, and I think that we have a lot of great ideas today and frameworks on how to do it. So it's not rocket science.
I wanted to throw one more thing into the kind of the pot. I mean, you've raised a lot of questions which I'd like to dip into in a minute, but the other thing I'd like to throw up, I mean, this conference is partly about measurement. So at national level, we talk about GDP, and we're saying that GDP is not really, is a limiting measure, and we need to think about the world more broadly. In corporate terms, we talk about net profit, we talk about EBITDA, cash flow. They're sort of the same. That's the kind of corporate version of GDP in a sense. Should our whole accounting, of corporate accounting, be different? To what extent have we started down that journey? And is that one way of kind of formalizing these new norms that you're talking about? If one accounts for these things, accounts for the sustainability of your business, accounts for the CO2 emissions you make, account for maybe the human and social capital, who knows? Is this pie in the sky, or is this something that could be done? If I maybe start with Professor Stiglitz and then...
Yeah, so first let me try to explore a little bit the parallel that you're making. When we began our work on the Commission on Measurement of Economic Performance and Social Progress, we began by looking at how well it measures ordinary market activity.
Yes.
And there are problems really with the measurement of profits in the way we usually do. So particularly important that is recently being discussed a lot is for many companies, their exposure to carbon risk.
Yes.
The fact is that if you are engaged in a business in which you're exposed to the consequences of a big change in the price of carbon,
Yes.
your books don't represent, in the way that we've traditionally done it, the risks facing the company. And there's a big initiative going forward to try to say, we've got to correct that problem. And when we do, I think that will make us more sensitive to the issue of carbon.
Because that addresses the externalities and the hidden
At least
costs
part
of
of
production.
at least it doesn't
Part
do
of.
it fully, but at least it addresses the risk which is being hidden.
Yes.
And in which some companies, like Exxon, deliberately try to hide. So that's one part. But the other part is that I think that what is sometimes called the triple bottom line, looking at the environmental impact and the social impacts, are organized ways of trying to think about these other impacts. I mean, they're not enough. You can't really, in those accounting frameworks, address all the issues that Malin was talking about in terms of your human relations inside the firm. But it's a minimum, but it's a start.
Malin, how much have the accounts of your own company and companies in general, do you think, changed, and how adequate is that?
Related to reporting.
Related to reporting, as it in turn relates to a broader definition of what well-being might be.
Yeah. I think first, I would say that when it comes to the non-financial reporting, I think we are like 30, 40 years behind the financial reporting because we don't really have the same defined indicators. Of course, we have, for example, on CO2, we have the scope 1, 2, 3, but it doesn't really give an appropriate figure because it's scope 1 and 2 often depends on how much outsourced you have within your value chain. So you can't really compare two different companies. So even though we have legislation in Europe now for non-financial disclosure, it's very poorly regulated so far. But just to connect to this CO2 reporting in a broader sense, I have a huge interest in the task force for climate-related financial disclosure, which I think you referred to, and I think that is an excellent framework actually, because the framework is really to describe how will your business look like in 20 years from now in a hopefully then sustainable society? How will the goods and people be moved in that society? And then calculate backwards. So when does different types of customers, like the coal industry or oil industry, disappear? When do we have to put the new products on the market? When do we see stricter regulations on CO2 in cities, for example? What happens related to operations in water stressed areas, for example? So it's more to describe the company from the future and backwards and see and explain about the preparedness for the future. And I think this is probably an easier way for also the investors to understand, okay, this company is prepared for the future. They have started their journey to transform their customer offer, but also make investments for the future.
I'm going to ask, please.
So in a way, in some of the work that we had done on national accounts, we talked about the importance of sustainability.
Yes.
And I think this is moving towards that. But another issue that we talk a lot about are the issues of equality and fairness. And I think that's an area where corporations have not, we don't have a framework. It's interesting, as part of Dodd-Frank, our financial reform bill in 2010, there was a requirement that firms, publicly listed firms, disclose the ratio of their CEO or top management pay to that of ordinary workers. And you would have thought that that regulation was the end of capitalism. The corporations lobbied very hard to make sure that this regulation did not go into place. And they delayed it for more than 5-6 years. But we now have it in place. And the reason is they didn't want transparency. They didn't want their shareholders or their workers to know the magnitude of the disparities and how it compares, for instance, between the United States and Europe. And, you know, Malin, you were saying that you're in a competitive landscape and you can't choose totally the wages you pay workers. But at the boardroom, actually, it appears as if the CEOs can choose. And in the United States, the average pay is about 350 to 1. And in Europe, it's about 1/10 of that, a little bit more than 1/10 of that. But it's not because you're less productive. It's simply because of the social norms that have been created that lead to something different.
Would you like to address that, I mean, I had a more sort of philosophical question, which sort of links to this in a sense, and then I will ask you about some sort of specifics of your company and how you act, you know, on the ground, which I think might be useful. But this philosophical question is really, if companies are left to their own devices, do you think that they naturally, and maybe there is no answer to this question, do they naturally kind of contribute to well-being, or actually are they, you know, is their bottom line the bottom line at all costs? You know, if there's no environmental legislation, then they will pollute. If there's no workers' legislation, then they will pay as little as possible and squeeze as much from their workers. In other words, can companies self-regulate themselves into providing well-being, into being part of this process? Or do they need outside regulation forcing them to do that? This goes, in a sense, to the heart of lots of what we talk about every day when it comes to the role of government, the role of the state. From a corporate perspective, from your perspective, how do you see that debate?
I think it has to be like a general answer, because I think that it's very much depending on the management of the company. I think there are a lot of self-regulated companies today, and I think it depends on the conviction of the CEO and the management team. Do we believe that well-being is equal to productivity? Do we believe that reduced energy consumption is a plus on the bottom line, etc., etc.? That sustainability is a key for being long-term successful. Then you don't need regulations, but unfortunately, it's not the case in all companies.
Yes.
And mainly the majority of the companies are not there, because this is also to understand thinking new, and this is not like business as normal. But during my 15 years in this position, I see a huge change among a lot of companies, because I think what we see is really that it goes in the right direction, and among consumers and customers have started to put requirements on us. If they say you have to have a certain level of work on, you have to respect your employees, you have to respect human rights, you have to work on environmental protection, otherwise you are not allowed to be a part of the tenders.
Yes.
So we also have a quality check, so to say, on companies, and that of course drives the progress when you see the business benefits of working on
because
well-being.
it gels with what the consumer wants, is what you're saying. Yes.
Exactly.
So I think this depends very sensitively across countries, across cultures. I think it's about the norms in any country. But we've created a global marketplace, and unfortunately there's what in economists we call a Gresham's law, a race to the bottom. And in the absence of adequate regulation, the system doesn't work. It would be great if we could rely more on self-regulation. Well, let me give just 3 examples that illustrate the point. The first, I was in a panel in January where one of the participants was the CEO of PepsiCo. And she was explaining how PepsiCo was very concerned about producing healthy drinks. But the reality is that other companies around her are interested in selling their products, and that includes products with a lot of sugar, which are causing childhood diabetes. And no matter how good her heart is, she has to wind up producing these drinks, which cause childhood diabetes.
Yes.
And there's no choice about it unless you have a regulation about these drinks that cause childhood diabetes. They will be put on the market.
And as you say, there are cultural norms, aren't there? So when Mayor Bloomberg tried to limit, say, the size of sugary drinks, Coca-Cola, etc., in New York, he was kind of pilloried.
He was pilloried for it. So the second example has to do with mining companies. I once was in a meeting with a large mining company and talking to a government officials, prime minister, and they were asking for regulation, environmental regulation. I said, afterwards, I said, why? And the answer was pretty clear. He said, there are there are private mining companies, I won't say from what country, that will come in, destroy the environment, and underbid us. And the only way, we don't want to go down that road. And the only way that we can effectively compete is to make sure that there are regulations that force everybody to protect the environment. And the third example that we all know about is the financial markets. The financial markets said, trust us, we will self-regulate. And we know where that led us. It was, again, a race to the bottom of reckless investments. And, there's a famous quote by the head of one of the New York banks. He says, as long as the music plays, we have to stop. We have
to keep dancing. It was in the Financial Times.
And so he knew it was not going to work out well, but the nature of the competitive marketplace gave him no choice. So my answer is, it would be great to create norms, to encourage that, but in the meanwhile, we have to realize that we are going to need a very heavy dose of regulation if we're going to get the kind of well-being that we want for a well-functioning society.
Right. Do consumers play any role? I mean, for example, there are consumers now who want to know, that maybe their coffee is sustainably grown, that people at the end of that supply chain are being decently paid. I mean, I would argue that consumer goodwill in itself is not enough, because actually coffee growers are not well paid, and there's often horrors at the end of a supply chain. But can consumers pressure companies to some extent to do the right thing? Well, it's for both of you, but Professor Stiglitz.
Yeah, obviously they can exert some pressure, but maybe, David, you can tell the story. We just had a discussion from Dannon. Do you want to tell us about vanilla in Madagascar?
Sure. Well, I went with a number of companies, including Mars and Danone and some of the big perfume companies, to Madagascar to find out about what was at the end of the vanilla supply chain. And there were a few things. One was that the companies involved, huge buyers of vanilla, really had no idea. They were there on a discovery tour, even though they were the main purchaser. And what was at the end was, very contradictory and hard to understand. Sometimes vanilla prices were rock bottom and people lived in absolute poverty, to the extent that in India people don't produce vanilla because it's not worth their while. So one of the reasons it's produced in Madagascar is because it's one of the few countries where people are poor enough to hand pollinate the vanilla as it now has to be, pod by pod. But then, for various complicated reasons, the prices of vanilla had soared and was now worth more than silver, pound for pound. So you had the equivalent of silver hanging from trees which of course then added to all sorts of weird social effects like armed gangs robbing vanilla, vanilla barons, blowing vanilla on wine, women, and song, and also, so at the end of this supply chain was all sorts of very contradictory, difficult stuff, and you could argue well beyond a single company, even a huge company's ability to control. But certainly they knew very little about what was going on, and to their credit, they were trying to find out. So I think there are all sorts of, in everything we consume, the things we've eaten today, if you track back to where that's produced, the coltan in your mobile phone, or the soybean in your tofu, you might not like what you find. Let me ask another question. This is a specific question. So you sell all over the world. So you'll sell in Germany, you'll sell in Britain, where presumably, there are clear regulations, you know roughly what the market's like. But you'll sell in places like Democratic Republic of Congo, having an election now, so it must be very democratic. What kind of safeguards, what problems do you encounter when you're selling into a market like that? And how do you, this topic of well-being, how do you think about that?
Thank you. I think talking about also the government's role, I think I wanted to connect to your question, because I think in Sweden we have had quite a successful policy change from the Swedish government, telling the Swedish companies who would like to have these export credit grants that if we sell like an excavator to a mine in Congo, for example, we have to understand the human rights impacts, we have to understand the environmental impact from the mine, and by using those assessments from the mine, we have to understand what kind of risks are there actually, and how can we use our leverage to mitigate those risks and improve the situation. And I think what this has led to is that the latest 5 years we have a tool or a process which actually our finance people are using to, in each of those business which we call to complex or unstable markets, we do an assessment on the customer and on the project that our products will be used for, to see can we use our leverage. And I think by taking a conscious decision about selling or not sell, and understand how can we use our leverage, that is of course something that leads to an improvement. And just one example, in Cuba, for example, we have now a pilot together with the Swedish government, because there is a state-owned mine, and there was quite bad, actually, working conditions and environmental track record. So what we do now is during a 3-year period, we try to use our leverage to influence to the better on this in this environment. And hopefully we can have a track record of saying that, yes, trade in the right way is actually better, because we always know that if we don't sell, someone else will sell.
Can I ask why you do that? I mean, is that because you're good people, or is it because you think that you can, in a sense, tell your consumers, look, we're doing things the right way, so buy our trucks rather than someone else's? Or, I mean, where does that...
I start with the business rationales first. Yes. Because first of all, we wouldn't get the credit grants from the government.
Okay.
So that was like a business decision. The second one is that we believe that working together with our customers to improve their performance, that strengthens the relationship with the customer, and the customers will be more loyal and they will stay with us and buy new products eventually.
Well, actually, if there's a business rationale, it's much more sustainable than if there's just a CEO who happens to have a kind heart who might get fired next year, So, I mean, that at least embeds it.
But let me just the business case is affected by government policy.
By regulation.
Yeah.
And I think that's really important to realize. Things have changed a lot in say, the last 20 years. I represented the United States in a ministerial meeting a little over 20 years ago, where the subject under discussion was whether bribery should be tax deductible.
Yes.
And there were several countries, I won't name them here, who vehemently argued that bribery was a business expense.
Yeah.
We had to spend the money to get the contract, and therefore it should be tax deductible.
Yeah.
Now, if you make it tax deductible, you are, in effect, encouraging
Yeah.
bribery. And the good news is that there was an agreement to make bribery non-tax deductible among all the OECD countries. And so movement in this direction, I think, is really changing issues of governance and getting a broader global agreements on these other issues of environmental and social policy are really important to stop the kind of race to the bottom that inevitably occurs if you don't have these governmental agreements.
I think that's an excellent place to stop. I'd like to thank our two fantastic discussants, and I thought that was a really interesting, probing discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you once again to our moderator and the two speakers for a fruitful session. Ladies and gentlemen, we've reached the end of the second conversation. We do need some time to set the stage before we move on to the next round table. So please allow us a little bit of time to set the stage. Bear with us. Please don't go anywhere too far. We'll just be a few minutes. Thank you very much. Before we start the session, let me briefly explain the online Q&A system, SimFlow. During the discussion, please go onto the URL shown on the screen or scan the QR code and submit your questions that you might have. The QR code can be found on the back of your name badge or on the leaflet inside the kit. And you can also access it through the forum application. Of course, we will receive questions from the floor in the more traditional way if we have some questions, and we'll be handing out some microphones. So if you have any questions, simply raise your hand and we'll be able to get some microphones to you. But as we have seen in some of the previous roundtable discussions, if the SimFlow is quite actively used, the moderators will just be selecting some of the questions from the SimFlow. Ladies and gentlemen, we will just need a few more minutes to set the stage. Please bear with us. We'll just be a few minutes. Thank you very much.